She never heard the warning, because at 14, deaf and gentle, Mia Carter was lost in the quiet poetry of signing her favorite song while carrying her dream-filled sketchbook, not knowing that the world around her had shifted in the blink of an eye when a single bullet struck, her body crumpling softly onto the pavement, her hands suspended mid-air in a haunting gesture of innocence, while sirens began their mourning far too late and chaos erupted in the small Georgia town that would never be the same. And behind that chaos stood her father, Elijah Carter, who carried more than grief. Buried deep inside him was a life built in shadows, honed in silence, a man shaped by secrets and ready to bring them crashing into the light. And when he crossed that library threshold, he didn't walk in as just her father, but as a reckoning wearing the weight of truths that had waited too long to speak. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The town of Rosewood never expected its quiet streets to carry the sound of gunfire, never thought its name would be etched into headlines that would spread across the country. But on that gray afternoon, as Nyla Brooks lay on the cold concrete, her sketchbook pages scattered like broken promises, questions began to ripple through the silence. Why did the officers open fire on a 14-year-old girl whose only crime was walking home, lost in the rhythm of her own world? Why did they see danger in the quiet language of her hands, in the soft arcs and movements that had always been her voice? And when the first reports started to surface, confused, fragmented, designed to shield the truth, one name kept appearing, whispered first in back rooms, then across the county: Marcus Brooks. Who exactly was Nyla's father? To some, he was just another grieving parent, a man shattered by loss and consumed by anger. But to others, those who knew what silence can hide, he was something more. A figure from a world most people will never see. A man with access, with reach, with a past that had been carefully erased. As crime scene tape fluttered in the wind and radio chatter hummed with half-truths, Marcus Brooks was already moving, quiet and deliberate, stepping off a plane under an alias known only to those who had worked beside him in places where shadows held the power of nations. What was the department hiding? What were they so desperate to bury that they would turn a child's innocence into a threat? And how far would a father go? Not just for justice, but for the truth, when every second felt like a lifetime, and every unanswered question burned hotter than the wound that had nearly stolen his daughter's life? Nyla Brooks was the kind of girl who filled quiet spaces with color. She was only 14, but her imagination stretched far beyond the edges of her small Georgia town. Her teachers said she could turn silence into art, sketching entire universes with the broken crayons and bent pencils that filled her backpack. Her favorite spot was the corner table of the Rosewood Public Library, where sunlight fell through dusty windows onto her sketchbook as she drew superheroes that looked like her. Black girls with hearing aids that shimmered like constellations, capes stitched from resilience and hope. At home, she signed her stories to her mother, Alana, at the kitchen table, their hands moving in an unspoken dance, laughter filling the room even when words could not. She loved pancakes on Saturday mornings, the smell of syrup drifting through their quiet house, and the way her father, Marcus Brooks, always slid the first plate across the counter to her with a smile that said more than words ever could. To everyone else, Marcus was just a quiet suburban dad, a man who kept his lawn neat, waved politely at neighbors, and disappeared into his garage on weekends to tinker with half-finished projects. But there were things about Marcus that even those closest to him never knew. He had once been a name whispered in rooms without windows, a cyber intelligence analyst for the FBI, the kind of man who could disappear with a phone call and reappear with information that could change the course of a case. He left that life behind after Alana's death, trading encrypted servers and secure briefings for bedtime stories and late-night kitchen talks with Nyla. But the past doesn't vanish. It waits. And in Marcus's home office, behind a locked trunk stamped with the word classified, his old life slept quietly, as if holding its breath. There were moments, small ones, when the weight of who he had been leaked through, the way his eyes scanned exits when he walked into a store, the way he never sat with his back to the door at a restaurant, the subtle tension in his shoulders that never fully faded. Nyla noticed, of course, but she never asked. To her, he wasn't an analyst, or an operative, or a ghost from a life too dangerous to name. He was just Dad. The man who read her sketches with reverence, who took her to the park on Sunday afternoons, who signed "I'm proud of you" every night before turning off her bedroom light. That day was no different. The air was soft and heavy, the late summer sky stretched wide and still. Nyla gathered her sketchbook and her headphones, out of habit more than function, and walked to the library, just as she had 100 times before. She signed softly to herself, movements light and fluid, as if the world understood her rhythm. Across town, Marcus leaned against the counter, a mug of coffee warming his hands, unaware that a patrol car had already started its slow crawl down Rosewood Avenue, its engine low, its driver watching, eyes narrowing at gestures he did not understand. And as Nyla stepped out of the library doors, the sketchbook tucked under her arm, signing the lyrics of a song only she could hear, the quiet hum of an ordinary afternoon carried her down the sidewalk, straight past the idling car, past the unseen danger coiled tight in its shadow, toward a moment that would split everything they knew into before and after. The afternoon was warm but quiet, the kind of stillness that makes you believe nothing can go wrong. Nyla Brooks walked down Rosewood Avenue with her sketchbook tucked tightly against her chest, signing her favorite song with movements as fluid and unbothered as the breeze. She didn't notice the patrol car idling at the corner, didn't see the way its shadow shifted when the officers inside adjusted their seats. In the front seat, Officer Philip Rourke's eyes followed her every step, his hand resting near the radio. His partner, Officer Brett Hanley, barely glanced up from his tablet, more focused on the updates coming in from dispatch. And then, with the press of a button, the radio cracked to life, low, sharp, and certain. Suspicious black female, mid-teens, unrecognized gestures. Approach with caution. The words, stripped of context, carried a weight heavier than they should have. Nyla kept walking, oblivious to the fact that every tilt of her head, every movement of her hands was being misread, filtered through fear and ignorance. She paused at the crosswalk, glanced up at the fading light, and signed a lyric she'd been working on for weeks. To anyone else, it was music in motion. To the men in that car, it was a threat they didn't understand. Rourke stepped out first, his voice sharp and cutting through the hum of the street. "Stop right there." The words meant nothing to Nyla, who continued forward, humming silently to herself, her fingers still painting invisible patterns in the air. Hanley called out, softer, less certain, but his voice, too, never reached her. A woman across the street, Tanisha from the corner cafe, froze mid-step, recognizing Nyla instantly. She pulled her phone from her apron pocket, muttering under her breath, "No, no, not her. God, no." And then it happened. The first shot was sharp and jarring, but for Nyla there was no sound, just the sudden force that ripped through her chest, a heat blooming where there had only been rhythm and quiet moments ago. Her sketchbook slipped from her fingers, pages scattering across the concrete like lost thoughts. For a split second, time fractured, her body crumpling, her hands frozen in midair, still forming the last sign of the song she had been singing. Across the street, Tanisha screamed, her voice cracking, raw and furious. "She's deaf! She's deaf!" Her words cut through the air, slicing through confusion and fear, but the damage had already been done. Hanley's hand shot out to push Rourke's weapon down, his voice desperate and shaking. "Jesus, Phil, what the hell are you doing? She's down. She's down." But Rourke's eyes were locked on Nyla, wide and unblinking, as if searching for a reason buried somewhere in her stillness. The second shot cracked but missed, splintering the sidewalk inches from her head, sending a wave of dust into the air. Tanisha, still recording with trembling hands, yelled again, "She's a child! She's deaf, you racist piece of—" Before her voice broke entirely, replaced by the rising pitch of chaos as people poured out of storefronts, their faces twisted with horror, confusion, disbelief. Nyla's body lay motionless, the pink of her hoodie darkening to a deep, terrible red. Her lips trembled faintly, her chest rising in shallow, fragile movements that no one seemed to notice in the noise and panic. Her cochlear implant, jolted loose in the fall, skittered across the pavement until it rested near the gutter, buzzing once before falling silent. Hanley crouched, hands shaking, whispering to no one and everyone all at once. She didn't stop. I told her to stop. Why didn't she stop? But the answer was there, obvious and damning, hanging in the air with every witness who saw her hands before the first shot rang out. She never heard them. She couldn't. From the corner, Tanisha's voice cut through again, fierce and broken. She was signing, you idiots. She was signing a song. She does this every day, every damn day. Her words, captured on her phone, would later circle the world, replayed in headlines and feeds, dissected frame by frame. But in that moment they were nothing more than echoes swallowed by panic. Paramedics were slow to arrive, sirens wailing distantly as people shouted for help, trying to stem the bleeding, their hands shaking as they pressed torn fabric against her wound. The officers frozen in place didn't move, didn't speak, as the small crowd around them swelled into something sharp, something uncontained. And while the street roared with chaos and fear, miles away in a quiet house where the air smelled faintly of coffee and late nights, a single device came to life. It had been silent for almost a decade, a ghost of a signal buried deep in layers of encryption, built for emergencies that were never supposed to come. The alert pulsed once, then again, as an old system recognized a name it hadn't been asked to track in years: Nyla Brooks. At that moment, Marcus Brooks, seated in his home office, looked down at his phone, its screen flashing with a code only he would understand. His hands tightened around the mug he was holding, his pulse steady but heavy, as the world he had tried to leave behind came rushing back in a single breath. As Nyla lay bleeding on the cold concrete, a silent message was already moving across secure channels, a signal that the ghost they once called a phantom had been awakened. And this time, Marcus Brooks wasn't just a father, he was a reckoning. The hospital doors swung open just as the ambulance screamed into the bay, and the chaos inside Rosewood Regional Medical Center swallowed the quiet of the night. Nurses shouted orders, their voices sharp and clipped. As paramedics wheeled Nyla Brooks down the hall, the metallic clang of the gurney echoing in a sterile blur of white walls and fluorescent lights. Blood trailed faintly behind her, a narrow red line marking every second that separated her from the last moments she had known a world without pain. Her pink hoodie, now dark and heavy, clung to her frame like an accusation, while her small, delicate hands, still stained with graphite from her sketches, lay motionless at her sides. In the waiting area, strangers watched silently, eyes wide, whispers slipping between them like static. She's just a child. She's deaf. They shot a deaf girl. And then, without announcement, without even the sound of hurried footsteps, Marcus Brooks appeared. He moved through the double doors like a shadow, his face unreadable, his eyes steady but carved with something harder than grief. No one spoke to him at first, not the nurses, not the security guard who instinctively reached for a clipboard, then froze when he caught the look in Marcus's eyes. He didn't ask where his daughter was. He didn't have to. His steps found her room as if pulled by instinct, by the silent thread that binds a father to his child. When he stopped at the doorway, what little light there was in that room fell across Nyla's face, pale, fragile, her hair matted with sweat, the steady rise and fall of her chest tethered to machines that beeped in a rhythm too slow, too fragile to trust. Marcus didn't move closer. He didn't speak. He just stood there, still and heavy, his silence louder than any scream could have been. Across town, in the cramped briefing room of the Rosewood Police Department, the narrative was already shifting. The chief of police, face flushed and voice sharp, barked orders over the hum of overlapping radio chatter. Get the preliminary report out. She failed to comply. Make sure the language is clear. Non-compliant behavior, erratic movements, officers in fear for their safety. Around the table, officers sat stiff, their eyes darting toward the body cam monitor on the far wall. The footage flickered, then froze, a corrupted file message flashing in red. Hanley leaned forward, his voice tight, almost breaking. The footage. What happened to the footage? No one answered him. No one dared. Across the room, Captain Mercer's gaze was cold, calculating, as he tapped a pen against the table, each click deliberate. "Control the story," he said, voice low, final. "If we lose control of the story, we lose everything." But the story was already slipping from their hands. At the corner cafe, Tanisha sat rigid in a booth, her phone still clutched in her trembling hands, the video she'd captured looping silently on the cracked screen. She didn't need to hear the voices to know what they said. She's deaf. She's deaf. By morning, that video would find its way onto social media. By noon, it would sit at the top of every feed, shared, reshared, dissected, replayed frame by frame. And the world would see Nyla Brooks, 14 years old, walking home in the soft light of an ordinary afternoon, her hands signing a song, just moments before her body hit the pavement. In the quiet of room 304, Marcus Brooks sat beside his daughter, one hand resting lightly over hers, his other gripping the edge of the chair with a stillness that betrayed none of what roared beneath his skin. The monitors around him hummed, steady and indifferent, the flat blue glow painting sharp lines across his face. He had promised himself years ago that he had left that life behind, that the quiet streets of Rosewood and the steady rhythm of small-town life would be enough for both of them. But as the hours stretched and the walls closed in, the past he had buried stirred awake. At 2:14 a.m., while the nurses moved in and out like ghosts, Marcus opened his phone. His thumb moved across the screen in a pattern etched into memory, unlocking a system that hadn't been touched in nearly a decade. The connection was instant, silent, and absolute. Within minutes, layers of encrypted data unfolded across the small device in his hand. Dispatch logs, officer reports, internal memos marked confidential, and buried in the noise, a single line that froze him in place. Behavioral threat flag, Nyla Brooks. Subject identified as high risk. Manual override authorized by Captain H. Mercer. Back at the station, the internal panic grew. Someone had noticed the intrusion. Someone knew that the firewall had been breached by an access key that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. "It's a ghost login," the IT specialist muttered, panic slipping into his voice. No signature, no location, no trace. Mercer's jaw tightened. Shut it down now. But it was already too late. Marcus had what he needed. By morning, Rosewood was no longer quiet. News vans lined the narrow streets. Protesters gathered outside the police department, their voices rising with one unified truth. She was signing, not threatening. Hand-drawn signs covered the front gates of the library where her sketchbook had fallen. Pages now warped and stained, but still legible. Images of heroes with brown skin and open hands taped to the windows like prayers. Inside, Marcus remained silent, his focus locked on a single thought. This wasn't random. Hours later, deep in the quiet of his home office, the locked trunk opened with a sharp metallic click. Inside, the remnants of a life no one in Rosewood had ever seen waited in neat, organized rows. Flash drives labeled with dates, encrypted key fobs, stacks of old clearance badges, a pistol wrapped in soft cloth. He moved with the precision of someone who had done this too many times to count, every action deliberate, controlled, inevitable. As the files loaded onto his private server, a name surfaced again and again. Fortis Systems, a predictive policing algorithm, a program designed to flag behavioral anomalies in public spaces. And in the log marked for the day Nyla was shot, one note repeated itself: unrecognized hand signals, high risk, engage with caution. Marcus sat back, the glow of the monitor painting sharp light across his features. His jaw clenched, but his eyes were cold, calculating, steady. This wasn't fear. This wasn't confusion. This was the quiet before the storm. The stillness of a man who understood systems better than the people who built them, and who knew, with perfect clarity, that the men who had pulled those triggers had no idea what kind of fire they had just lit. And as the world outside his home erupted, protests swelling, media circling, the name Nyla Brooks trending across every platform, Marcus Brooks began to move. Quietly, efficiently, a father sharpening himself into the very weapon they had never seen coming. The files came together slowly, layer upon layer of encrypted code unraveling under the steady rhythm of Marcus Brooks's hands. Every keystroke pulled him deeper into a system that had been designed to be invisible, a lattice of firewalls and false leads built to keep ordinary people from ever learning the truth. But Marcus was not ordinary. He had written codes like this in another lifetime, back when secrets like these could shape the outcomes of nations. Now those same skills worked against the people who had drawn a target on his daughter's back. The screen in front of him glowed pale against the dim light of his office, each file another puzzle piece in a picture that only grew darker the further he dug. The pattern was undeniable. The Rosewood Police Department wasn't acting alone. They were part of a pilot program known as the Predictive Threat Index, an algorithm designed and maintained by a private defense contractor, Fortis Systems. On paper, it promised safety, claiming to detect behavioral anomalies before they escalated into crime. In reality, it was a netcast over the most vulnerable, flagging children like Nyla, children who moved differently, looked differently, communicated differently, as potential threats to be neutralized before they ever had the chance to be understood. As Marcus scrolled through the logs, his jaw tightened. Line after line, timestamp after timestamp, the evidence piled higher. Subject, male, age 11, flagged for repetitive movements on school grounds. Subject, female, age 9, flagged for frequent hand gestures on public transit. Hundreds of profiles, each one reduced to data points on a grid, each one carrying the same unspoken label, threat. The deeper Marcus went, the clearer it became. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't panic. This was policy. At Rosewood Regional, Nyla slept, her small frame dwarfed by the machines that kept her tethered to the world. Her hand twitched occasionally, a reflex, a quiet reminder of the life still moving beneath the pain. Marcus sat in the chair beside her bed, the glow from his laptop casting a muted light across his face. He looked at her, so still, so impossibly fragile. And for a moment, the weight of it all threatened to pull him under. But Marcus Brooks didn't break. He leaned closer, his voice low, steady, meant for her ears alone. "They don't get to bury you in silence," he whispered, his fingers brushing lightly against her hand. "Not this time." His phone buzzed once. Kira, the only person he trusted enough to bring into this. A former colleague, a ghost in the same system that had erased him. "Marcus," her voice crackled softly through the line. "I've mirrored the logs. It's worse than we thought. This isn't just Rosewood. This program is statewide, maybe further." Marcus didn't blink. His gaze stayed on Nyla as he spoke, voice quiet, controlled. "Send me everything. Every update, every backup. They built this thinking no one would notice. They were wrong." At the precinct, the walls were closing in. Captain Mercer's voice was sharp, clipped, the edge of panic wrapped in forced authority as he demanded answers from a room full of officers who no longer dared to meet his eyes. "We stay ahead of this," he barked, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "No leaks, no admissions. We follow protocol until this dies down." But even as he spoke, his words were hollow. The story was no longer theirs to control. Back at the hospital, Marcus's laptop screen shifted, filling with live access to dispatch recordings, encrypted threads of communication between command and the officers on the ground. And there it was, the final confirmation. 10 minutes before the first shot, someone at Rosewood PD had manually flagged Nyla Brooks. No AI trigger, no automated response. This was a human decision. Someone, somewhere, had typed her name, marked her as high risk, and authorized the approach that left her fighting for her life. The quiet in Marcus's chest hardened into something sharp, a clarity that settled over him like a weight he'd been carrying his entire life. This wasn't fear. This wasn't grief. This was resolve, steady and absolute. Outside the hospital, the protests grew. Signs filled the night, candles flickered in the hands of strangers, and voices carried a message that cut through the noise. She was signing, not threatening. Inside, Marcus remained a shadow at her bedside, his mind already moving, building the framework of what came next. They had tried to erase her story before it began. They had turned her voice into data, her innocence into risk, her quiet joy into danger. But they had forgotten who Marcus Brooks was. And as the clock on the wall ticked quietly toward dawn, the man the system had erased, the one they thought would never surface again, leaned closer to his daughter, his voice low and steady, a promise and a warning in one. They don't get to decide who you are, Nyla. They don't get to make you a statistic. This ends with us. The first file leaked just before dawn. It was quiet, almost invisible at first. A data drop buried inside a secure server, anonymous and untraceable. Within minutes, though, the silence broke. The file wasn't a simple document. It was a chain of encrypted logs, dispatch recordings, body cam data, and internal memos. A living blueprint of everything that had led to the moment Nyla Brooks's small body hit the concrete outside the Rosewood library. It carried timestamps, officer IDs, signatures of authorization, and a single undeniable truth. This had never been an accident. By noon, every major news outlet had picked it up. Headlines screamed across screens from New York to Los Angeles. Predictive policing flagged deaf teen before shooting. Anchors struggled to explain what they were seeing. Experts debated algorithms and bias, but the footage spoke for itself. There was Nyla, 14 years old, wearing her favorite pink hoodie, her hands moving with the soft rhythm of a song only she could hear. There was the first flash of a gun. There was the moment everything stopped. The video spread like fire. In less than an hour, the hashtag "Armed Hands Are Not Weapons" surged across every platform. Artists painted murals of Nyla's hands frozen in mid-sign. Teachers shared stories of deaf students struggling to be understood. Mothers across the country posted videos teaching their children basic ASL, captioned simply, "For Nyla." Outside Rosewood Regional Medical Center, the crowd swelled. What started as a handful of neighbors holding candles turned into thousands of people lining the streets. Deaf families, students, church groups. Strangers who had never met Nyla but carried her name as if it belonged to them too. The quiet hum of solidarity became something louder, more powerful, a unified demand that could not be ignored. And then came the arrests. The Department of Justice, pushed by public outrage and undeniable proof, moved quickly. Captain Hal Mercer was led out of the precinct in handcuffs, his face pale and expressionless as cameras clicked in rapid succession. Alongside him, two officers, Philip Rourke and Brett Hanley, were booked, their badges sealed in evidence bags. City officials who had signed off on the Predictive Threat Index program without oversight were suspended, pending federal investigation. The small town of Rosewood, once quiet and faceless, had become the epicenter of a reckoning that stretched far beyond its borders. Inside the hospital, Marcus Brooks stayed quiet. He didn't care about the flashing lights outside, the reporters shouting his name, the flood of messages calling him a hero. None of it mattered. All that mattered was the steady beeping of the monitor beside Nyla's bed and the rise and fall of her chest. It was just past midnight when her eyes fluttered open. At first there was confusion, the white walls, the wires, the faint hum of machines. And then her gaze shifted, finding him sitting there motionless but alive with a kind of quiet relief that only a father could understand. Her lips trembled, but no sound came. She didn't need to speak. Her hands moved slowly, shakily but with purpose. "Dad." Marcus leaned forward, his voice breaking for the first time in days. "I'm here, Nyla. I'm right here." The next day, with her doctor's hesitant approval, Marcus helped her sit upright, the glow of a small camera positioned just above the foot of her bed. The live stream went out to the world unannounced. No polished graphics, no headlines, just Nyla, pale but unbroken, her eyes sharp with quiet determination. Her fingers moved slowly, deliberately, every sign a blade cutting through the noise. The soft, translated voiceover echoed her words for those who could not read her hands. "They tried to take my voice," she signed, pausing as tears welled but never fell. "But I was never silent." The stream went viral within minutes. Millions watched as she continued, her hands steady now, her message undeniable. "You cannot erase me. You cannot erase any of us. We deserve to be seen. We deserve to be safe." The comments poured in by the thousands. Parents, teachers, strangers typing messages of love, rage, and solidarity. And in cities across the country, people gathered in quiet circles learning to sign her name, learning to sign "I see you." In Washington, federal hearings opened within days. Lawmakers, pressed by the weight of undeniable evidence and an outraged public, froze all active predictive threat index programs nationwide. Contracts with Fortis systems were suspended, and a sweeping investigation began, exposing years of bias embedded in lines of code that had marked children as criminals before they'd even learned what the word meant. But for Marcus Brooks, none of that mattered as much as the quiet moments that came after. Sitting in that hospital room, holding his daughter's hand as she drifted in and out of sleep, he felt the kind of peace that only comes when you've fought for something bigger than yourself and won. At least for now. And yet, the work wasn't done. One evening, long after the crowds outside had thinned and the news vans had packed up, Marcus sat in his office, the glow of his monitor reflecting off the dark windows. Lines of code streamed across the screen, familiar patterns whispering secrets only he could hear. Then, buried deep within the encrypted server he'd broken wide open, another name flashed. Different town, different child, same program, same flag. Marcus stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. His hand hovered over the keyboard, steady, deliberate. Somewhere in another quiet town, another family was sleeping under the weight of a system that saw their child not as a person, but as a problem waiting to be solved. He closed his eyes, hearing Nyla's voice in the silence. Not her words, but the strength in her hands when she signed. "They don't get to decide who we are." The fight wasn't over. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits, patient, silent, steady, for the moment someone is willing to stand and fight for it. That's what Marcus Brooks did. That's what every parent, every neighbor, every stranger holding a candle in the streets of Rosewood did. They refused to look away. They refused to let a 14-year-old girl be reduced to a statistic, to a line of code on a corrupted server. And because of that, Nyla Brooks's story is no longer just hers. It belongs to everyone who knows what it feels like to be unseen, unheard, or misunderstood. It belongs to everyone who understands that silence is not surrender. It is strength, waiting to be named. If this were your daughter, if you had watched her body hit the pavement because someone decided her hands were dangerous, what would you have done? Would you have stood silent? Or would you have carried her name into every room, every space, until the world was forced to hear it? Think about that. Sit with it. And then tell us, in the comments below, what you would have done, what you would have said, and what justice means to you when the people who are supposed to protect are the ones pulling the trigger. Because this story isn't just about Nyla and Marcus Brooks. It's about every name that never made it into the headlines, every family that never got their moment in front of the cameras, every child flagged by a system that decided their difference was a threat. Their stories matter, and they need to be told. And if you thought this story was shocking, if you believe these stories should be told, if you believe that silence should never be the last word, subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Let Nyla's name, and every name like hers, travel further than the streets where their voices were quieted. Because the more people who see, who understand, who refuse to look away, the closer we all come to a world where hands are never seen as weapons, And silence is never mistaken for compliance. This isn't just a story. It's a reminder, a promise, and a call to action.